My mother stood in the spotlight of the work I had created, calling my $500 million genius her vision, before pushing me into a difficult situation. She fired me to bury the truth, but she forgot that I was the one controlling the destiny of this empire. I didn't just leave. I pressed the power button. I withdrew every line of code I owned, giving her 72 hours to watch her world crumble. I stood on the brink, watching the city lights flicker one last time, feeling the weight of the silence about to engulf us. The Chicago skyline tonight is a jagged ribcage of steel and neon, cold enough to turn breath into ghosts. From the 88th floor penthouse of the Sterling Plaza, the city looks like a playground for the gods, but I've always known it's a labyrinth for the lonely. I stood in the server room, and a space of humming silence and sterile blue light that felt more like home than any ballroom ever could. While the elite of the Midwest toasted my mother's visionary leadership just a few dozen yards away, I was busy making sure that vision didn't collapse into a pile of digital ash. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Lines of green code cascaded down the monitors, a rhythmic waterfall representing the pulse of our global operations. This was the Nexus system, my creation, my secret, and the only reason the Sterling name wasn't currently being dragged through a bankruptcy court. Real power doesn't need a spotlight. It's the quiet foundation that holds the entire building up. My father taught me that before the cancer took his voice, and I've spent every day since trying to prove I was listening. I adjusted a final line of encryption, securing a $30 million international transaction for a resort in Dubai. It was a silent gift, one of thousands I've given to a family that treats me like a ghost in the machine. I watched the confirmation light blink amber, then green. Success. Another day of survival for the Sterling Empire, bought with the sweat of the daughter they preferred to keep in the shadows. The heavy oak doors of the technical suite creaked open, and the muffled roar of the gala flooded the room like a physical blow. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of over-expensive perfume and calculated malice arrived before she did. My mother, Lizzie, took the stage on the monitors I was monitoring, and her voice booming through the internal speakers. She spoke of unwavering leadership and her sole vision, a narrative that neatly erased my 10 years of 14-hour days. Suddenly, the air in the small room changed. Menendez, my middle sister, stepped into my peripheral vision. She wasn't here to check on the servers. She held a glass of vintage Bordeaux, her eyes glittering with a predatory sort of joy. I kept my eyes on the screen, my jaw tight, my knuckles white against the desk. "Steffi," she began, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "You really should learn to socialize. You look like you're rotting in here." Before I could reply, she made a practiced, theatrical stumble. The deep red liquid arched through the air, splashing across my modest linen blouse and soaking into the very workstation that kept her lifestyle afloat. The wine dripped from the edge of the mahogany desk, a dark stain that looked remarkably like blood under the fluorescent lights. I sat perfectly still, the cold moisture seeping through my clothes, feeling the heavy weight of a humiliation that had been years in the making. "Oops," Menendez sneered, her mask of innocence slipping instantly. "You smell like old circuit boards in desperation, Steffi. Mom wants the IT girl out of the sightlines. The photographers are looking for the real Sterlings, and you're ruining the aesthetic. Clean yourself up and vanish before you embarrass us further." I didn't scream. I didn't throw the glass back. I simply took a deep breath, the scent of the wine cloying and bitter. I reached for a microfiber cloth and wiped a stray drop from my cheek with a grace that made her smirk falter. I stood up, my stature small, but my presence immovable. "Kindness is a wealth you clearly cannot afford, Menendez," I said, my voice steady, like a bell tolling in a frozen valley. "I'm not leaving because you told me to. I'm leaving because my work here is finished, truly finished." I walked past her, my wet heels clicking on the tile with a sound that echoed like a countdown. I didn't head for the gala. I moved through the back service corridors, the veins of the building I knew better than my own reflection. I stopped in the long hallway leading to the service elevators, where a portrait of my father hung in the dim light. I reached out, my fingers tracing the gold leaf of the frame, the wood cool and solid beneath my touch. I whispered a silent promise to the man who gave me his brain, but forgot to give me his shield. Stacy, the family's longtime legal counsel, stepped out of the shadows near the elevator bank. His hair was thinner than I remembered, his eyes heavy with a pity that felt like an insult. He held out an encrypted drive, his hand trembling slightly. Steffi, I tried to explain the licensing, he stammered. I took the drive, the cold metal biting into my palm. I shook my head, a small, sad smile playing on my lips. Don't pity me, Stacy. My father used to say a bridge is only useful if it leads somewhere. This one has reached its end, and the toll has become too high for me to pay. I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors slide shut on the only life I had ever known. The descent was rapid, a stomach-churning drop from the heights of Chicago royalty to the reality of the pavement, and I walked out of the service entrance and into the freezing rain. The Sterling Plaza sign glowed brilliant gold above me, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet asphalt. My loyalty had been treated as a peripheral weakness, a bug in the system they thought they could just patch over. They were wrong. My intelligence wasn't a service I provided. It was an invincible weapon I had spent a decade sharpening. I found a small, 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. It smelled of burnt coffee, old grease, and the honest exhaustion of people who worked for their bread. I took a corner booth, the neon sign in the window buzzing like an angry hornet. I opened my personal laptop, the screen reflecting in the darkness of the window. My name is Steffi, and I've spent my life building walls for people who eventually locked me out. Now, it was time to see if they knew how to survive without the architect. The cursor blinked on the screen, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the silence of the diner. I pulled up a command prompt that looked like gibberish to the untrained eye, but to me, it was the keys to the kingdom. I hovered my finger over the enter key, staring at the words, Master Override, revoke all licenses. I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. Not the heat of revenge, but the cool clarity of a boundary finally drawn in the sand. I pressed the key. The digital ghost of my work began to evaporate from the servers 3 blocks away, leaving behind a hollow shell of a billion-dollar empire. The cold Chicago morning light didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like an autopsy. I sat in that diner until the sun began to bleed through the gray clouds, watching the city wake up to a crisis I had quietly orchestrated. When I finally stood up to head back to Sterling Plaza, my joints were stiff and my clothes were still damp with the wine Menendez had so gleefully shared. I looked at my reflection in the diner's cracked mirror, pale, exhausted, but with eyes that were terrifyingly clear. Walking into the executive boardroom was like stepping into a refrigerated vault. The air was sterile, smelling of expensive leather, and the metallic tang of high-stakes anxiety. Lizzie sat at the head of the massive glass table, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of maternal concern that didn't reach her eyes. To her right, Eileen adjusted her pearl necklace with an air of bored superiority. To her left, Menendez tapped her manicured nails against a leather-bound folder. They looked like a portrait of success, polished and untouchable. I didn't take a seat. I stood near the door, my wrinkled linen blouse a sharp, silent scream against their designer silk. A house divided against itself cannot stand, yet they were currently pouring gasoline on the foundation just to see if the sparks would match their jewelry. Lizzie didn't look at my face. She looked at the folder she was sliding toward me. It was a heavy, weighted movement, the sound of paper on glass echoing in the silent room. Steffi, we need to stabilize the situation, Lizzie said, her voice smooth as polished stone. The Nexus system is too vital to be left in a state of personal volatility. We've drafted the papers to transfer the intellectual property rights to Eileen. It's for the protection of the shareholders and the Sterling legacy. I opened the folder, but I didn't see a transition plan. I saw a death warrant for my career. Nestled among the legal jargon was a digital document bearing my encrypted signature, a transfer of all Nexus rights to Eileen Sterling, dated 2 nights ago. My heart slowed to a cold, rhythmic thud, as I remembered the security update Lizzie had asked me to authorize while I was half asleep after a 40-hour coding marathon. It wasn't a glitch. It was a sophisticated phishing trap designed by my own mother. Eileen scoffed, a dry, rattling sound in the back of her throat. It's truly for the best. You have the brain of a back-office clerk, Steffi, not the face of a global CEO. We are just protecting the family from your inherent limitations. I looked at the document, then back at the woman who had brought me into this world. A person's integrity is like a signature. Once you forge it on a lie, you lose the right to call it your own. I didn't sign that paper to give you the system, Mother. I signed my trust in you, and that is what you've truly stolen. I felt a strange, detached pity for them, but they were so focused on the jar that they had completely forgotten who actually knew how to control the lightning. I won't be signing the voluntary resignation, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but filling every corner of the room. I had already noticed the flaw in their haste. Under Illinois law, a transfer of assets of this magnitude requires physical witnesses and a notary's seal for the underlying corporate bylaws, a detail they had overlooked in their rush to bury me. Menendez stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. Don't be difficult, Steffi. We can have security escort you out like a common trespasser. Think about the headlines. The headlines are already written, Menendez, I replied, gathering the few personal items I had left in my bag. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, and I walked toward the door, my head held high, my spirit untethered for the first time in a decade. On my way to the elevators, I passed the cubicle of Marcus, a junior clerk I had mentored for years. He looked up, his eyes wide with the fear of someone who knew the ship was sinking. I reached into my bag and placed a small bar of dark chocolate and a handwritten note on his desk. Keep your head down, Marcus. The weather is changing. Even in the middle of a corporate execution, I refused to let them turn me into a ghost. I stopped at the threshold of the boardroom one last time. Lizzie was already whispering to her lawyer, her face already moving on to the next task. I looked at the 3 of them, the mother who betrayed me, and the sisters who relished it. You think you've captured the lightning because you have the jar, but you've forgotten that I am the one who built the glass. I wish you all peace, because very soon you will have absolutely nothing else to hold on to. As I walked out through the revolving glass doors of Sterling Plaza, the Chicago wind hit me with a familiar, brutal honesty. An idling black SUV from a rival tech firm sat at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. My phone pinged in my pocket. A notification from the Nexus secondary server. IP security breach detected. Master override engaged. The Chicago wind didn't just blow. It searched for weaknesses in my damp coat as I stepped out of the black SUV. The city lights were blurred by a freezing drizzle that turned the pavement into a mirror of broken promises. I watched the taillights of the vehicle disappear, leaving me on a sidewalk in a North Side neighborhood that had seen better decades. Every step toward my studio apartment felt like wading through wet concrete. My body was a hollow vessel for exhaustion, yet my mind remained a sharp, glowing filament in the dark. I reached the curb of my building and stopped. The breath left my lungs in a jagged puff of white mist. There, piled like refuse under the weeping sky, were towers of black trash bags and open cardboard boxes. I didn't need to check the labels to know what they contained. My father's vintage books, the leather covers already swelling with moisture, lay discarded on top of a heap of my clothes. The scent of damp paper and old memories hit me harder than the cold. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A sharp, intrusive buzz. I pulled it out to see a text from Menendez. "The Sterling name carries weight in this city, Steffi. Our associates don't appreciate tenants with moral turpitude issues. Enjoy the fresh air." The landlord, a man who had practically bowed to my father for 20 years, had folded like a paper crane the moment Lizzie made the call. It wasn't just a firing. It was a scorched earth campaign. I stood over the remains of my life, the rain dripping from the brim of my hat. I reached down and pulled a water-damaged photo of my father from a gap in a box. The ink was bleeding, his smile dissolving into the gray paper. I remembered the day he told me, "Steffi, they can take the roof from over your head, but they can never take the stars from your eyes unless you let them." I gripped the frame until my knuckles turned white, feeling the rough edges bite into my palm. A movement in the shadows caught my eye. An elderly man sat huddled in the alcove of a nearby brick building, his frame shivering beneath a thin, soaked blanket. We were two ghosts in a city of millions, both discarded by systems that found us inconvenient. I looked at the umbrella in my hand, a sturdy, oak-handled thing my father had owned. Without a word, I walked over and held it out to him. "Take it," I whispered, my voice a raspy thread in the wind. The man looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion and a flicker of forgotten dignity. "It's not much, but we both deserve to stay dry in this storm." He reached out with a trembling hand, and for a second, our fingers touched. A brief spark of human warmth in a night of absolute zero. I walked away before he could thank me, leaving behind the trash bags and the books I could no longer carry. That was when the weight of the betrayal finally shifted from a burden to a catalyst. The 24-hour diner on the corner was a sanctuary of fluorescent hums and the smell of burnt decaf. I slid into a corner booth, the red vinyl cracked and cold against my legs. The waitress didn't ask questions. She just set a mug of steaming coffee in front of me and moved on. I pulled my laptop from its waterproof sleeve. It was an old machine, a custom-built rig that looked like a relic compared to the sleek tablets at the office. But this was the one piece of hardware the Sterling family had never touched. They viewed it as a toy. I knew it as the cockpit of their empire. I logged into the secondary secure layer of the Nexus system. My fingers moved across the keys with a rhythmic, percussive intensity. I wasn't looking for a way back in. I was looking at what they were doing with the keys I had left behind. Real-time data streams began to populate the screen in a waterfall of crimson and gold. I saw the unauthorized access points. I saw Lizzie and Eileen already rerouting millions into consulting fees directed at offshore accounts in the Caymans. They weren't just incompetent. They were looters. They were stripping the ship for parts before it even hit the iceberg. A deep, cold clarity washed over me. A sensation like ice water being poured into my veins. Evil is not a monster that lives under the bed. It is the choice to value a dollar over a daughter. And it is the calculated decision to treat a human soul as a depreciating asset. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger is a hot, messy emotion that clouds the judgment. What I felt was the calm, surgical resolve of an engineer about to remove a tumor. I navigated to the core directory, the place where the Protocol 0 script had sat dormant for 3 years. I had written it as a failsafe, a way to ensure that the brain of Sterling Plaza could never be used as a weapon for greed. The Sterling family believed they had bought my soul when they paid my salary. They were about to learn the difference between an employee and an architect. According to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and my private filings for Innovate Solutions LLC, the Nexus system was a licensed product, not a work-for-hire asset. Lizzie's fraudulent IP transfer was a house built on sand, and I was about to pull the tide in. This wasn't revenge. It was the enforcement of a boundary that should have never been crossed. I stared at the blinking cursor, the green light reflecting in my pupils. I typed the command. Execute Protocol 0. Owner revocation. My finger hovered over the enter key. I thought about the thousands of employees who would be confused tomorrow morning. I thought about the chaos in the lobbies and the frozen elevators. But the law is a double-edged sword, and they had spent years sharpening the edge that was now turned toward them. I pressed the key. A progress bar appeared, filling with a slow, deliberate grace. 10%, 35%, 70%. At 100%, a single line of text appeared. Authorization revoked. Master shutdown initialized. And I looked up from the screen and out the diner window. Far off in the distance, the gold-lit Sterling Plaza sign that dominated the Chicago skyline began to flicker. One by one, the letters dimmed. S, T, E, until the dark silhouette of the building was swallowed by the night. The heart of their empire had just stopped beating. I shut my laptop with a quiet, decisive click. I wasn't walking away because I was weak. I was walking away because the bridge I built was no longer safe for me to cross. I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, feeling the heat settle in my chest. The waitress came back to refill my cup, her eyes lingering on the TV mounted in the corner. A news alert broke through the late-night weather report. A frantic anchor spoke over a grainy shot of a darkened Sterling Plaza. Reports coming in of a massive, unprecedented technical blackout at the prestigious Sterling Plaza. International payment gateways are frozen, and guests are reportedly trapped in elevators. The cause remains unknown. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just felt the stars in my eyes brighten a little. When my heart stopped beating, my body stopped too. They were about to know that I was the heart of their empire. The world was about to witness what would happen when the last invisible architect left his work. I looked at my coffee cup, steam rising under the neon lights. I had no home, no family, and no job. But I had myself. The sun didn't rise over Chicago the next morning. It simply bruised the sky into a dull, aching violet. I sat in a public library, at the quiet hum of the heater and the smell of old parchment providing a sanctuary from the chaos I had unleashed. On the communal television near the entrance, the news was a frantic blur of blue and red. The Sterling blackout had become a national headline. I leaned back in my chair, watching the dominoes fall from a safe, anonymous distance. In the grand lobby of Sterling Plaza, the scene was pure pandemonium. I watched through a live stream as credit card machines flashed "access denied" in a rhythmic, mocking pulse. VIP guests, people who had paid thousands for a single night of Sterling luxury, were being locked out of their suites because the Nexus system had withdrawn its digital blessing. Because the brain was gone, the raw, unencrypted logs of the last 5 years began flickering across the massive digital displays in the lobby. A ghost in the machine finally speaking its truth. The screens, usually reserved for serene images of Sterling properties, were now a scrolling ledger of betrayal. Secret transfers to offshore tax havens in the Caymans, labeled with Lizzie and Menendez's private authorization codes, were laid bare for every investor and journalist in the room to see. Investors stood frozen, their phones held high to capture the evidence of the fraud. The Sterling perfect vision was dissolving into a digital puddle. The truth is like water. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually, it will find the smallest crack and tear the whole wall down. I left the library and made my way to the law offices of Stacy, located in a somber, pre-war building that felt like a fortress of history. The air in his office was thick with the scent of leather-bound books and the gravity of the law. Stacy sat behind his heavy oak desk, looking as though he hadn't slept in a decade. He gestured for me to sit, his hands trembling as he opened a weathered file that bore my father's signature. He revealed that my father hadn't just left a business. He had left a dead man's clause embedded in the corporate bylaws. It was a fail-safe, A legal tripwire triggered the moment I was forcibly removed from the board without cause. According to the Illinois Trust Code, the Nexus system was never a corporate asset. It was a personal trust resource, held by me, Steffi Sterling, as an independent creator. Lizzie's attempted theft of the IP wasn't just a family dispute. It was a federal crime. Stacy reached into his desk and pulled out a small, intricately carved music box my father had given me when I was a child. He had kept it safe all these years, a piece of my heart hidden in a drawer of legal documents. I ran my thumb over the polished wood, feeling the familiar grooves of the past. I looked at Stacy, seeing the shame in his eyes, and I felt a sudden, profound wave of forgiveness. Fear makes us do many things, Stacy, but courage is the choice to be honest when the cost is highest. Thank you for choosing now. I stood up and paced the small office, my mind moving 3 steps ahead of the family. I refused to use the offshore fraud data to blackmail my mother. That would make me no better than her. I simply wanted the truth to be the final arbiter of this tragedy. Now I instructed Stacy to prepare a formal notice of revocation of license. We would give the board a 48-hour window to settle all outstanding debts to the hotel employees before the system was permanently erased. You don't win by making others lose. You win by being the only person left standing with a clean conscience. My father's voice echoed in my mind, a steady anchor in the storm of my own making. I sat back down and signed the legal documents with a steady hand. I wasn't doing this out of hate or a desire to see them fall. I was doing it out of a duty to the thousands of room attendants, janitors, and clerks whose pensions were currently being gambled away by my mother's greed. I felt a strange sense of peace as I handed the papers back to Stacy. For years, I had been the invisible architect of their success. But now, I was the visible guardian of the truth. Stacy nodded, his expression one of somber respect, and gathered his briefcase to deliver the notice to the Sterling board. He knew, as I did, that the era of the Sterling dynasty was over. The only question left was how much would be left in the ashes. As the heavy door to the office clicked shut, my phone began to vibrate on the desk. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I hesitated, then swiped to accept the video call. Lizzie's face appeared, her perfect hair disheveled, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying rage I had never seen before. She wasn't pleading for mercy. She was staring at me through the screen with a look that promised a total, scorched earth war. "You think you've won, Steffi?" she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating growl. "You think these little legal games will save you? I've already spoken to the commissioner. By tonight, there will be a warrant for your arrest for industrial espionage and extortion. I'll make sure you rot in a cell before I let you touch my company again." I didn't blink. I didn't let the fear reach my eyes. I simply stared back at the woman who had traded her daughter for a title. They think a cornered animal is dangerous, but they have no idea what a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove can do. I ended the call without saying a word, the silence of the room reclaimed by the ticking of the grandfather clock. The game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than even I had imagined. The grandfather clock in Stacy's office continued its indifferent rhythm, but the world outside was dissolving into a fever dream of betrayal. I stood by the window, watching the rain wash over the Chicago skyline, feeling the sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere. The call from Lizzie hadn't just been a threat. It was a declaration of total war. I could feel the invisible noose tightening, the legal and social machinery of the Sterling name grinding into gear to crush the daughter who dared to defy them. The setup was as surgical as it was depraved. Within 48 hours of the system shutdown, Lizzie and Menendez appeared on every major news network in a televised emergency press conference. They stood before a bank of microphones at the Sterling Plaza, their faces carefully pale, their eyes brimming with rehearsed tears. Lizzie spoke of a family tragedy turned digital nightmare, claiming that I, and Steffi Sterling, had kidnapped a key executive who had mysteriously vanished. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical blade when she played the evidence. It was a recording of my voice, an AI-generated deepfake, demanding a $50 million ransom and threatening to destroy the hotel's servers if the police were involved. She was using my own technical brilliance as a weapon to brand me a digital terrorist. The Chicago PD immediately issued an all-points bulletin for my arrest. Watching from a hidden monitor in a secluded safe house, I felt a chilling realization. A mother is supposed to be the first harbor a child knows, but mine has become the storm that seeks to sink me. The legal noose began to pull tight near Michigan Avenue. I was nearly caught in a police dragnet as I tried to move toward a secure location. Blue and red lights reflected off the wet pavement like a predatory trap. I had to rely on my intimate knowledge of the hotel's infrastructure, the old service tunnels built in the 1920s that the family had long forgotten. I moved through the damp, narrow passageways, the sound of my own frantic breathing echoing off the brick walls. They took this empire for granted, never bothering to learn the secrets of the foundation I had spent a decade maintaining. I contacted Stacy through an encrypted channel, my fingers trembling as I typed. He warned me that the district attorney was under immense political pressure from Lizzie's high society donors to sign a no-knock warrant. They wanted me silenced, not just arrested. It was in those dark tunnels, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, that I understood I could no longer simply hide. But truth is not a shield you hide behind. It is a spear you must learn to throw. My strategy had to shift from a desperate defense to a public unmasking. Even in the grip of this pursuit, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. In the deeper recesses of the tunnels, I encountered an elderly woman, a homeless soul who had sought shelter from the freezing rain. She was struggling with a heavy, tattered bag, her breath coming in labored gasps. I didn't think about the police or the warrant. I stopped, taking the weight of the bag from her and helping her to a drier corner. "Keep going, ma'am," I whispered, pressing a few crumpled bills into her hand. "The light is just at the end of the hall." It was a small moment, but it proved that my character remained untainted by the toxic greed of the Sterlings. The decision to face the lion came with the dawn. I realized that fleeing the state would only confirm their lies. I needed to walk directly into the heart of the storm, the very press conference where Lizzie was martyring herself. I spent the remaining hours preparing a digital death switch. It was a secure folder containing the real, unedited server logs, the offshore fraud records, and the original contract drafts Stacy had recovered from my father's files. In America, the court of public opinion is often as powerful as the court of law, and I was about to give them the ultimate story. I thought of my father as I prepared for the final confrontation. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is looking. But justice is making sure everyone eventually sees the truth. I had spent my life as the invisible architect, as the quiet daughter who fixed the problems everyone else ignored. Now, I would be the architect of their downfall. I wouldn't seek revenge, but I would demand accountability. I owed it to myself, to my father, and to the truth that Lizzie had tried to bury under a mountain of lies. I donned a simple professional suit, the one I had bought for my first board meeting years ago. I wiped the grime and the exhaustion from my face, staring at my reflection in a shard of broken mirror. I didn't see a victim or a fugitive. I saw a woman who had finally found the boundaries of her own worth. My heart was steady, a rhythmic drumbeat in the silence of the safe house. The world was watching now, Mother. Let's see how well you can act when the script is no longer yours. I made my way toward the grand press hall, bypassing the heavy security at the front by using the service entrance I knew so well. I stood behind the heavy oak doors, listening to the muffled sound of Lizzie's voice as she continued her performance for the cameras. My hand gripped the handle, the cold metal a final anchor before the plunge. I pushed the doors open, the sudden burst of 100 camera flashes blinding me. The room fell into a shocked, suffocating silence as I stepped into the light. A police officer immediately moved toward me, his hand reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. But I didn't stop. I walked toward the podium, my eyes fixed on Lizzie's face. The mask of the grieving mother began to crack, revealing the cold, naked fear beneath. The double oak doors of the grand press hall groaned as I pushed them open. But the sound was instantly swallowed by the rhythmic explosion of 100 camera flashes. The air inside was thick with the scent of ozone and high-stakes desperation. Lizzie stood at the podium, her face a masterpiece of practiced grief, spinning a tale of a daughter's betrayal to a room full of hungry journalists. When I stepped into the center aisle, the room didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum. I wasn't alone. Stacy walked beside me with the grim determination of a man correcting a decade of silence, flanked by 2 federal agents whose presence acted like a physical barrier against the chaos. A uniformed officer moved to block my path, his hand hovering over his holster as he barked an order to halt. Stacy didn't flinch. He thrust a laminated document forward, his voice cutting through the tension. Federal Protective Order. Steffi Sterling is a protected whistleblower under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Stand down. The officer's arm dropped. I kept walking. The sound of my heels on the white marble floor was the only heartbeat the room had left. I passed Eileen and Menendez, who sat in the front row like statues of frozen glass, their eyes wide with a terror they couldn't yet name. As I reached the podium, the ambient noise of the crowd faded into a dull hum in my ears, replaced by the steady, cold clarity of my own purpose. I looked directly into the camera lenses, my reflection tiny and sharp in the glass. A lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes, I said, my voice echoing with a calm authority that made Lizzie stumble back. Today the shoes have arrived. I didn't wait for her permission. I plugged my secure drive into the media hub, and the massive monitors behind the stage flickered to life. The kidnapping narrative Lizzie had meticulously crafted dissolved in seconds. I played the original server logs, side by side with the AI-generated deepfakes she had used to frame me. The room erupted in a low, vibrating murmur of disbelief. But I wasn't finished. I pulled up the encrypted ledgers, the real ones, showing the massive embezzlement Lizzie and Menendez had funneled through the Sterling accounts. The evidence was surgical. I displayed the legal title of the Nexus system, proving it had always been a personal trust resource, never a corporate asset. I watched the color drain from Lizzie's face as the software analyzed her forged signatures on the transfer documents in real time, flashing red fraud indicators across the screens. Eileen suddenly lurched forward, her face twisted in a mask of rage, her voice a shrill scream of, "Liar!" I didn't flinch. I looked at her with a pity so deep it felt like a physical weight. "I don't hate you, Eileen," I whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I pity that you've spent your whole life being a character in a script Mother wrote for you. You don't even know who you are without her lies." She stopped mid-stride, the anger in her eyes flickering into a hollow, lost confusion. The final blow came not from me, but from the federal agents. They stepped to the microphones, their voices clinical and cold. They announced that based on the evidence provided by my whistleblower filing, the SEC had officially frozen all Sterling Plaza accounts. The $500 million empire wasn't just in trouble. It was officially insolvent. Bankruptcy was no longer a threat. It was a settled fact. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The cameras caught every agonizing detail of Lizzie's collapse. She didn't fall to the ground. She simply folded into her chair, her spine snapping under the weight of the fallen crown. The Sterling matriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified woman facing a future of federal indictments and public ruin. She reached a trembling hand toward me, her lips moving in a silent plea for me to fix it, to save the family name one last time. I pulled my hand back. It wasn't an act of malice, but a necessary boundary. Forgiveness is a private matter, Mother, but accountability is public, I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. You didn't just fire me. You fired the only person who was keeping the truth from destroying you. You chose the illusion over the foundation, and now the building is gone. The hall descended into a frenzy of questions, but I was already moving toward the exit. I heard the agents informing Lizzie and Menendez that they were required for immediate questioning regarding insurance fraud and grand larceny. My name was no longer a label for a clerk or a shadow. It was the name of the woman who stood still while the world around her burned. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the Chicago sunset. The sky was a bruised orange, beautiful and indifferent. As I walked down the stone steps, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a message from an unknown, encrypted number. The debt is paid, but the files are gone. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The weight of the last decade seemed to lift, leaving me lighter than I had ever been. The scent of salt and damp earth rose from the Lake Michigan shoreline, a stark contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned betrayal I had lived in for a decade. I stood on the sand, watching the gray water churn under a pale morning sun. Behind me, far off in the cityscape, the massive cranes were already in place. I watched through a pair of binoculars as the iconic Sterling sign was dismantled piece by piece. The gold-plated letters that once defined my prison were being lowered into the bed of a flatbed truck, destined for a scrapyard or a foundry. It was no longer a monument to a mother's ego. It was now just cold, heavy metal being cleared away to make room for something honest. The liquidated empire provided a strange, somber kind of justice. I didn't want the money to sit in a vault, and I certainly didn't want it back in the hands of the women who had hollowed out my father's dream. I sat in the modest staff lounge of what used to be the flagship hotel, a room I had visited 1,000 times to fix a printer or a router. Today, I wasn't there to maintain the machinery. I was there to maintain the people. Through the altruistic dissolution clause Stacy and I had hammered out in the federal receivership, I used my legal ownership of the Nexus system to prioritize the human foundation. I sat across from Maria, a room attendant who had worked for us for 20 years, and handed her a severance check that included every penny of back pay and her full pension. I did the same for the janitors, the cooks, and the security guards. I watched the tension leave their shoulders, a wave of relief that felt more valuable than any dividend. The only currency that keeps its value in the dark is the kindness you showed someone who could do nothing for you. Steffi Sterling was no longer a name on a payroll. I was finally a person standing among people. A week later, I forced myself to visit the ruins of my family. Lizzie and Menendez were living in a modest legal defense residence, a cramped brick house that smelled of stale coffee and unwashed pride. There were no shouting matches when I entered. The air was thick with the heavy, suffocating silence of consequences. Lizzie looked older, the sharp edges of her ambitions softened by the reality of a pending trial. She didn't ask how I was. She asked for a loan, a bridge, to start a small boutique venture, a way to claw back into the light. I looked at the woman who had framed me for kidnapping and felt a profound, quiet surge of pity. I gently refused the loan. Instead, I handed her a document for a restricted trust that would cover their basic living expenses and medical insurance, but nothing more. No capital for schemes. No fuel for the fire. I am not keeping this money from you to punish you. Mother, I said, my voice steady as the tide. I am keeping it to protect you from the version of yourselves that needs to dominate others to feel alive. Menendez turned away, staring at a blank wall, but Lizzie looked at me with a hollow, searching gaze. You cannot start the next chapter of your life if you keep rereading the last one. I've closed the book, Mother. You should too. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. The shadows of their influence were retreating, leaving me standing in the raw, honest light of my own making. My new office didn't have a view of the lake, but it had a view of a community garden in a neighborhood that was building itself back up. It was a clean, minimalist space that Stacy, Marcus, and the junior developers who had followed me helped build from scratch. There were no gold signs. There was no sterling branding. Just a simple door that said, Phoenix Systems. I walked to my desk and pulled out a final photo of my father, the one I had rescued from the rain on that terrible night a month ago. I looked at his face for a long time, thanking him for the brain he gave me and the quiet strength he instilled. Then, I placed the photo in a velvet-lined drawer and clicked it shut. I didn't need the memory to anchor me anymore. I had become the woman he always knew I was, and I no longer needed to look back to know where I was going. I turned toward the window, watching the Chicago dawn break over the rooftops. Success isn't about how high you climb or the names you put on buildings. It's about how many people you bring with you when you finally reach the top. I thought about the thousands of employees who now had their futures secured. I thought about the developers in the next room who were working on something that would actually help people, not just harvest their data. I am not a Sterling anymore. I am simply Steffi. And in this quiet, sunlit room, that is more than enough. I sat down at my workstation, the familiar hum of the servers providing a gentle, reassuring soundtrack to a life that finally belonged to me. The shadows are behind me now. I'm finally walking into the sun. A new notification flashed on my primary monitor, a sharp, hopeful green. Project Phoenix. Initialized. 1,000 schools connected. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. The first real, unburdened smile in years. My work wasn't finished. It was just beginning. Many of you have spent years building the invisible foundation for others' success, only to be cast aside when the spotlight shines. Have you ever had to burn down a bridge just to save your own soul? I want to hear your stories in the comments. Your resilience is the real legacy, and I read each one.